The night the room changed. The city lights of Las Vegas shimmered like scattered diamonds under a velvet sky, alive with music, ambition, and illusion. It was the early 1960s, a time when the world was changing, but not fast enough for everyone. Inside the grand showroom of the Sands Hotel, elegance ruled the room. Crystal glasses clinked softly, tuxedos gleamed under golden chandeliers, and the air carried the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken hierarchies. At the center of it all stood a man who had already conquered stages across America. Sammy Davis Jr. He wasn't just a performer. He was energy, precision, soul. Every step he took on stage was a declaration: I belong here. And yet, not everyone in the room agreed. The weight behind the smile. Sammy adjusted his cufflinks backstage, his reflection staring back at him in the mirror. His smile, sharp, polished, practiced, was ready. But his eyes told a different story. They carried history. They carried nights he wasn't allowed to stay in the same hotel he performed in. Moments when applause ended at the stage, but respect didn't follow him off it. Behind him, the muffled sound of the audience grew louder. The show was about to begin. A stagehand peeked in. 5 minutes, Sammy. He nodded. 5 minutes, he repeated softly, almost like a ritual. But tonight felt different. He couldn't explain it, but something in the air felt heavier than usual. The room that didn't want him. The curtain rose. And just like that, magic. Sammy exploded onto the stage with charisma that no prejudice could suppress. His voice flowed like silk, his movements were electric, and for a moment, the entire room forgot everything else. Or at least most of them did. Near the front, at a table lined with expensive whiskey glasses, sat a man who wasn't impressed. He leaned back in his chair, eyes cold, lips curled with quiet disdain. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He was waiting. The moment everything slowed down. Mid-performance, Sammy moved across the stage, connecting with the audience, eye contact, rhythm, presence. And then, it happened. A voice cut through the music. Loud, sharp, intentional. Hey, you don't belong here. The room froze. It wasn't just what was said, it was how it was said. The kind of sentence meant not just to insult, but to remind someone of their place. The band faltered for half a second. Sammy heard it. Of course he did. But he didn't stop. Not yet. He kept performing, because that's what professionals do. But something had shifted. The music continued, but the room had changed. People looked at each other. Some uncomfortable. Some pretending not to notice. Some silently agreeing. A lifetime in one breath. Inside Sammy's mind, time slowed. That one sentence didn't just belong to that man. It echoed from years of rejection. From doors closed quietly. From smiles that faded the moment he stepped away. He had worked twice as hard. Performed twice as well. Endured twice as much. And still, it wasn't enough for some. But tonight wasn't just another night. The silence before the storm. Sammy finished the number. The applause came, but it wasn't the same. It was hesitant, fragmented. The room didn't know what to do. And Sammy stood there. Center stage. Lights on him. Eyes watching. A decision hanging in the air. He could ignore it. He could move on. He could swallow it, like he had so many times before. But something inside him refused. A voice that didn't shake. Sammy stepped forward. Closer to the edge of the stage. Closer to the audience. Closer to the man. The band went quiet. The room held its breath. And then Sammy spoke. Not with anger. Not with rage. But with calm, controlled strength. I've spent my whole life being told where I don't belong, he said. His voice was steady, but it carried weight. But tonight, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Silence. Deep, heavy silence. The kind that forces people to confront themselves. The door opens. And then, from the side of the room, A chair moved. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Someone stood up, a figure familiar to everyone in that room, a presence that carried its own gravity. The king himself, Elvis Presley. He had been watching, listening, waiting, and now he was walking toward the stage, a room about to change forever. Every eye followed him, not just because he was famous, but because of what it meant. Because in that moment, everyone understood. What he did next would matter. Not just for Sammy, not just for that night, but for something bigger, something beyond the walls of that showroom. Sammy stood still, watching him approach, not knowing exactly what was about to happen, but knowing one thing for certain. This night was no longer just a performance, the walk that changed everything. The distance between the stage and the tables wasn't far. But that night, it felt like history itself was walking across the room. Every step taken by Elvis Presley carried a weight no one could ignore. The music had stopped. The laughter had died. Even the clinking of glasses had surrendered to silence. All that remained was tension. The eyes of the room. People turned in their chairs, some slowly, some all at once. Waiters froze mid-step. A cigarette burned forgotten between a man's fingers. No one spoke, because everyone understood something instinctively. This was no longer about entertainment. This was about a line, and whether it would be crossed or erased. Sammy's stillness. On stage, Sammy Davis Jr. stood completely still. No movement, no smile, no performance mask. For the first time that night, he wasn't entertaining the room. He was simply standing in it. And that alone was powerful. His eyes followed Elvis. Carefully, not with expectation, not with hope, but with awareness. Because Sammy had lived long enough to know. Moments like this don't always go the way they should. The man who spoke. At the front table, the man who had thrown the insult shifted in his seat. He hadn't expected this. Not this level of attention. Not this kind of response. At first, there was confidence in his posture. A kind of careless arrogance. But as Elvis got closer, that confidence began to crack. Not visibly, but subtly. A tightened jaw. A stiffened shoulder. A glance that flickered for just a second too long. A presence that didn't ask permission. Elvis didn't rush. He didn't storm. He didn't perform. He simply walked. Slow, direct, certain. The kind of walk that doesn't need to announce itself. Because everyone already feels it. He reached the table. Stopped. Looked down. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. But clearly. And unmistakably. The question that was loud. Elvis spoke. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. What did you say? 4 words. Simple. Controlled. But they carried more weight than shouting ever could. The man shifted again. This time more noticeably. I didn't mean anything, he muttered, attempting to brush it off. A weak retreat. The kind people make when they realize they've stepped somewhere they shouldn't have. Silence that pressured the truth. Elvis didn't respond immediately. He just looked at him. And in that silence, something uncomfortable began to grow. Because silence, when held by the right person, becomes louder than any accusation. The man tried again. It was just a joke. A few people at nearby tables avoided eye contact. Some stared at their drinks. Others watched, unable to look away. Because now, it wasn't just about one man. It was about everyone in that room. The line gets drawn. Elvis leaned slightly forward. Not threatening, but deliberate. There's nothing funny about disrespect, he said. Still calm. Still controlled. But now clear. the kind of clarity that doesn't leave room for interpretation. The man didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. A shift in the room. Something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. It moved through the room like a quiet wave. People straightened in their seats. Eyes that had been avoiding the moment returned to it, because they were witnessing something rare. Not a performance, not an act, but a choice. The turn toward the stage. Elvis didn't stay there, didn't wait for applause, didn't demand agreement. He turned and began walking toward the stage. The same slow, certain steps. But now, the room followed him. Not physically, but emotionally. Sammy watches. Sammy hadn't moved. Not even an inch. But inside, something was shifting. Not relief. Not gratitude. Something deeper. Recognition. Because what had just happened wasn't about being defended. It wasn't about someone stepping in to save him. It was about something far more rare. Someone stepping up to stand with him. The moment before impact, Elvis reached the stage, stopped just at the edge, looked up at Sammy. For a brief second, nothing was said, but something passed between them. An understanding, unspoken, but undeniable. The gesture that echoed. Then Elvis did something no one expected. He stepped onto the stage, walked straight to Sammy, and without hesitation, stood beside him. Not in front, not above, beside, equal, present, unapologetic. The room that finally understood. That's when it hit. Not as noise, not as reaction, but as realization. Because in that single act, everything had been said. No speech could have done more. No argument could have gone further. The message was clear. He belongs here. The silence that spoke loudest. No one clapped. Not yet. Because the moment wasn't asking for applause. It was asking for awareness. And for a few seconds, the entire room sat in it. Fully, uncomfortably, honestly, a nod that meant more than words. Elvis looked at Sammy, gave a small nod. Nothing dramatic, but enough. Sammy nodded back. And just like that, something unspoken was sealed. The show was over. Elvis stepped back, moved off the stage, returned to his seat. No attention, no spotlight, just action then exit. But the impact stayed. The breath before the return. Sammy stood there, looking out at the audience again. But this time, the room looked different. Not completely changed, but shifted. And sometimes, that's how change begins. Not all at once, but in a moment. The voice that came back stronger. Sammy took a breath, stepped forward, and said, "Now where were we?" A small line, but it carried something new. Not just confidence, but grounding, ownership, power. The music returns. The band picked up. Soft at first, then stronger. And Sammy moved again. But this time, something was different. Every step hit harder. Every note carried more weight. Every movement said something beyond performance. A night that wouldn't be forgotten. Because what happened that night wasn't just a moment. It was a marker, a reminder that sometimes it only takes one person to stand up, for an entire room to sit differently, the echo that refused to fade. The applause came late, not because the performance lacked brilliance, but because the room needed time to understand what it had just witnessed. And when it finally came, it wasn't polite. It wasn't routine. It was different. Stronger, heavier, almost like people were clapping, not just for the music, but for themselves, for staying silent earlier. The sound that carried meaning. On stage, Sammy Davis Jr. didn't acknowledge it right away. He kept moving, kept singing, but now every note carried something more than rhythm. It carried truth, because when a man has nothing left to prove, he doesn't perform to be accepted. He performs because he already knows his worth. The man in the crowd, at the same front table, the man who had spoken earlier sat frozen. The same chair, the same drink, but not the same presence. The confidence was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness, because for the first time that night, he wasn't invisible in the crowd. He had been seen, not by everyone, but by the one person it mattered most to. And that kind of exposure changes something inside a person. The ripple begins. By the time the final note of Sammy's set faded, the room had transformed. Not completely, but undeniably. People stood, applauded longer, some louder than necessary, as if trying to make up for something. Others clapped slowly, thoughtfully, like they had just learned something they didn't expect to. Backstage where truth lives, behind the curtain, the energy shifted again. The lights were dimmer, the noise was softer, but the air was heavier. Sammy walked in. No audience now. No spotlight. Just silence. He removed his jacket slowly, set it down, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel. Not anger, not relief, but something more complex. Something quieter. A knock that meant more. Then, a knock. Soft. Controlled. Sammy didn't turn immediately. He already knew who it was. The door opened, and there stood Elvis Presley. No entourage. No announcement. Just him. Two men, no audience. For a second, they just looked at each other. No words. Because sometimes, the most important conversations don't start with speaking. They start with understanding. The first words. Elvis stepped in, closed the door behind him. "You all right?" he asked. Simple, direct, real. Sammy let out a quiet breath. "I've been called worse," he said. There was a hint of humor in it, but it didn't hide the truth behind it. The truth beneath the surface. Elvis nodded, not because it was okay, but because he understood what that meant. Because hearing something once is one thing. Hearing it your whole life is something else entirely. The line that changed the moment. "You shouldn't have to be," Elvis said. That was it. No long speech. No grand statement. Just a sentence that carried the weight of what should have been obvious all along. A pause that spoke volumes. Sammy looked at him. Really looked this time. Trying to read something deeper. Because moments like this, they matter, but they also raise questions. Real ones. "Why did you do it?" Sammy asked. Not aggressively. Not suspiciously. Just honestly. The answer that was complicated. Elvis didn't hesitate. Because it was wrong. No hesitation. No performance. No need to dress it up. Just truth. And sometimes, that's the most powerful thing a person can offer. The weight of that simplicity. Sammy let those words sit. Because they weren't complicated. But they were rare. Too often people explain. Excuse. Avoid. But rarely do they stand on something that simple. It was wrong. And that's enough. Outside the room. What they didn't see. What no one inside that room could fully grasp yet. was that the moment had already begun to travel. A waiter told another. A musician mentioned it in passing. A guest whispered it to someone else at the bar. And just like that, the story began to move. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. The story grows legs. By midnight, it had left the building. By morning, it had reached places that had never been inside that showroom. People started repeating it. Not perfectly, not accurately every time, but the core remained the same. Something happened. Someone spoke, and someone stood up. Why it mattered more than they knew. Because it wasn't just about who said what. It was about what it represented. A shift, a challenge, a moment where silence didn't win. And those moments, they don't just stay where they happen. They spread. Back inside, a different kind of conversation. Sammy sat down. Across from Elvis. Two men. Two journeys. Two very different experiences of the same world. And yet, in that moment, there was a shared understanding. The reality that still existed. Tomorrow, Sammy said quietly, it'll still be the same out there. He wasn't being negative. He was being real. Because one moment, no matter how powerful, doesn't erase everything. The response that carried hope. Elvis nodded. Yeah, he said. A pause. Then, but tonight was. And that was the difference. That was the point. Change doesn't start by fixing everything. It starts by proving something else is possible. The quiet agreement. Sammy leaned back slightly. A small smile, real this time, formed. Not wide. Not performative. Just honest. Then maybe that's enough for now, he said. A moment that became meaning. They didn't shake hands. Didn't make a scene. Didn't turn it into something dramatic. Because it didn't need that. What happened was already enough. The world outside was listening. By the next day, the story had grown. People debated it, questioned it, admired it. Some dismissed it. Others held on to it. But no one could completely ignore it. Because truth has a way of staying. Moments like that don't disappear. They settle. They linger. They return when needed. They remind people that standing up doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes, it just requires stepping forward. And that's how change begins. Not with noise, not with crowds, but with one decision. In one moment. That refuses to stay small, the night that didn't end. Some nights fade. They dissolve into memory, blurred by time, softened by distance. But not this one. This night didn't end when the lights dimmed. It didn't end when the crowd went home. It didn't end when the doors of the Sands Hotel closed behind the last guest. Because what happened inside that room refused to stay there. The morning after, a different kind of noise. The city woke up like it always did. Cars moved. Neon signs flickered off. Coffee cups filled hands that had barely slept. But beneath the surface, something was different. Because conversations had already begun. Not loud, not official, but everywhere. The story that wouldn't stay small. At a diner across the street, a waitress leaned over a counter. You hear what happened last night? A cab driver nodded slowly. Yeah, I heard. A musician, still carrying his instrument case, added. People are saying it wasn't just a show, it was something else. No one described it the same way. But everyone felt the same thing. Something shifted. The man who couldn't forget. At a quiet table alone sat the man who had spoken that night. The same man. The same voice. But not the same certainty. His coffee had gone cold. Untouched. Because for the first time in a long time, He was replaying something in his head. Not what he said, but what happened after. The weight of being seen. There's something unsettling about being corrected publicly. But there's something deeper about being corrected without anger, without humiliation, without noise, just truth. Because that kind of moment doesn't attack you, it reflects you. The question that stayed. He remembered the silence. Not the words, not the attention. The silence, that heavy, uncomfortable pause where no one rushed to defend him. No one laughed. No one agreed. That silence had said something, and now it wouldn't leave him alone. Across town, a different reflection. Miles away in a quiet room, Sammy Davis Jr. sat by a window. No stage, no spotlight, just morning light stretching across the floor. He held a cup of coffee in his hands, but like the man across town, he hadn't taken a sip. A life of moments like that. For Sammy, it wasn't just about last night. It was about every night that came before it. Every glance, every hesitation, every moment where he had to decide. Do I respond or do I endure? And for years, he had endured, not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to keep going. But this time was different, because last night, he didn't stand alone. And that changes something. Not the world, not overnight, but something inside. Across another room, quiet reflection. Elsewhere, Elvis Presley sat with a guitar resting against his leg. He wasn't playing, just thinking, because what he did didn't feel like something extraordinary. It felt simple, necessary, obvious, and yet, the reaction told him otherwise. The realization. That's when it hit him. If something so simple felt so rare, then maybe the problem wasn't complexity. Maybe it was silence. The power of a small decision. Elvis didn't make a speech that night. Didn't try to change the world. Didn't plan a moment. He just made a decision. In real time. In front of real people. And that's what made it powerful. Because moments like that multiply. By the end of the week, the story had traveled further. Through conversations. Through stories retold. Through people who weren't even there. And each time it was told, it carried something forward. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. A young listener. In a small apartment miles away. A young boy sat at the edge of a radio. Listening, not to the music, but to a story someone was sharing. And then he stood up, the voice said. And everything changed. The boy didn't fully understand the details. But he understood one thing. Someone stood up, when it would have been easier not to. And that idea stayed with him. Because change does announce itself. It doesn't arrive with certainty or guarantees. It begins quietly, inside people, inside moments, inside decisions. And then, it spreads, back to the man at the table. Days later, the man returned to the same venue. Same seat, same table, but not the same mindset. The room looked the same. The stage looked the same. But something inside him was the moment of choice. Another performer walked on stage. Different face, different voice, but familiar tension in the room. And for a brief second, he felt it again. That same old instinct. That same impulse. The one that had led him to speak before. But this time, he didn't. He stayed quiet. Not out of fear. Not out of pressure. But out of awareness. And sometimes, that's where change begins. Not in grand gestures, but in restraint. The legacy of one night. Because that's what that night became. Not a headline, not a spectacle, but a reference point. A quiet reminder that things can be different. Two men, one moment, endless impact. Sammy kept performing, kept pushing, kept proving, not to others, but to himself. Elvis kept doing what he always did, but now with a deeper understanding. That influence isn't just about being seen. It's about what you do when you are seen. The truth that remains. The world didn't change overnight. It never does. But something did. A line was noticed. A silence was broken. A moment was created. That refused to disappear. Because some moments stay alive. Not in history books. Not in headlines. But in people. In decisions. In the quiet choices made long after the moment is gone. The final thought. Kindness doesn't always look loud. Courage doesn't always look dramatic. And change doesn't always start big. Sometimes, it begins with one person, taking one step, in one moment, that everyone else chose to ignore.